She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The salute was invisible, but it echoed louder than the siren. Some uniforms weigh more than others. Hers carried history. Dawn was barely brushing the rooftops when the hum of tires met the gravel of a quiet Georgia road. The air was thick with the promise of heat, and somewhere far off, a mockingbird rehearsed the morning's chorus. She drove alone, windows down, sunglasses resting low on her nose, a calm that had been earned, not borrowed. The car was modest. Her posture wasn't. Back straight, shoulders squared, the kind of quiet bearing that made strangers stand up straighter without knowing why. On her left wrist, a small leather band, worn, cracked, military-issued. When the lights flared behind her, she pulled over with practiced ease. No panic, no questions. She reached for her ID, not the civilian one, the one that bore 4 stars and the weight of 32 years of service. But they didn't ask for it. They didn't look. 2 white officers approached with a swagger that smelled of assumptions. One rested a hand on his weapon. The other asked her to step out. And just like that, history repeated itself. Not with bullets or fire hoses, but with plastic cuffs and lowered eyes. The patrol car had been idling for a while before it moved. Officers Derek Maddox and Tyler Cruz had just finished a routine traffic stop when they noticed the black SUV turn onto the back road, one of those half-paved stretches on the outskirts of Fort Benning. Maddox muttered something about tinted windows and took the wheel. The light bar flicked on lazily, casting red and blue over the quiet trees. General Elaine Drummond wasn't late. She wasn't rushing. The SUV belonged to her, bought outright after her last deployment. She was wearing civilian clothes, a black blouse, slacks, and flat shoes. But the lanyard around her neck, barely visible under her collar, held a badge that could silence entire rooms. As the patrol car came into view behind her, she sighed and pulled over. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She'd done this before, too many times. Not like this exactly, but enough to know the script. Her fingers reached for her wallet slowly, deliberately. She kept both hands on the steering wheel. Maddox approached with a cocky stride. Cruz followed, hand resting near his belt. "License and registration," Maddox said, not looking her in the eye. Elaine handed over her credentials wordlessly. Maddox glanced, frowned, and handed them to Cruz without a word. The two stepped back, whispering, unsure. Something didn't align. A black woman in an expensive SUV. The Department of Defense seal on her ID. Cruz looked back toward her, uneasy. "We're gonna need you to step out of the vehicle," Maddox said, voice harder now. "I'm a Major General with the United States Army," Elaine said calmly. "You have everything you need to verify my identity." Maddox scoffed. "Step out of the car, ma'am." She sighed, unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The cuffs clicked before she could speak again, not rough but tight, perfunctory. Maddox turned her around, ignoring her ID entirely. Cruz looked away. On the side of the road, in the rising heat of a southern morning, a decorated black general stood in silence while 2 patrolmen tightened her wrists with plastic ties. "Am I being detained?" she asked, her voice level. "You're being cooperative," Maddox replied. Her phone was in her purse, still unlocked, still open, one button away from a direct line to a private Pentagon switchboard. She said nothing. Cruz began to sense something was wrong, the way she didn't argue, the way her eyes didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid, just observing. He looked again at her ID, the stars, the name, the DOD watermark. "Derek," he muttered, stepping back toward the cruiser. Maddox was already guiding her to the back seat. "This is a mistake," Cruz said under his breath. Elaine didn't speak again. She sat in the back seat, posture perfect, wrists bound, and eyes fixed on something far beyond the dashboard. The mockingbird had stopped singing. A call was made, not by her, but by a satellite operator who had been quietly listening through the open line. One call, no sirens, no shouting, no lawsuits, just coordinates, badge numbers, and silence. Back at the base, a civilian liaison officer paused mid-conversation. A quiet ripple moved across a line of desks at the Pentagon. Somewhere, someone stopped eating breakfast. In a matter of minutes, careers had been placed on a timeline neither Maddox nor Cruz could yet see. But Elaine saw it. She had seen it all before. They made her stand in front of the cruiser. Sunlight slid off her dark skin, caught in the fine lines around her mouth, and lingered in the soft silver beginning to appear at her temples. Her blouse had wrinkled where they'd fastened the cuffs, and the sharp creases of her slacks had begun to fold at the knees. She remained still. Traffic began to stir. A school bus passed slowly. The driver glanced, frowned. A jogger on the far side of the road slowed, then picked up pace again. The visual was unmistakable. A black woman, hands restrained behind her back, flanked by 2 white officers. They hadn't searched her. They hadn't read her rights. Maddox was pacing now, agitated. Cruz stared down at her credentials as if willing them to change. "You need to call this in," Cruz muttered. Maddox shook his head. "We don't walk it back now." Elaine's mind drifted, not to panic or anger, but to a boy named Travis, Afghanistan, 2006. 19, shaking, with a shattered ankle and a photo of his mother taped to the inside of his helmet. She'd carried him 2 miles on her back when air support failed. She didn't remember the weight, only the way he apologized the whole way there. She blinked. The memory faded. A familiar face appeared, Colonel Richard Mensa, liaison for military police interactions in the region, walking briskly toward them with a plainclothes DoD agent behind him. No words, just presence. Maddox stepped back as if pushed. "You will remove the restraints immediately," Mensa said. Elaine turned her head slightly, acknowledging him, but did not speak. It was not her voice they needed now. Cruz, pale, moved to unlock the cuffs. His hands trembled. "Ma'am, he began. "Don't," she said quietly. Her wrists were free again, but the marks would last longer than they seemed. She reached for her phone, still in the front seat. A single notification blinked. Call connected. Secure line. She ended it. That was all that needed to be done. Mensa pulled Maddox aside. His tone didn't rise, but his words cut through the distance. Cruz stood frozen, watching Elaine inspect her wrist briefly before slipping the leather band back over it. Her hands were steady. She always kept them that way. The officers were ordered back into their cruiser, but they lingered, uncertain whether to leave or wait. The plainclothes agent walked Elaine a few feet away from the scene. "I'm sorry," he said, not looking her in the eyes. "I'm not," she replied. There was no statement, no press. She didn't need it. The mechanisms had already been triggered. An inquiry, an internal review, careers sealed behind closed doors, invisible to the public eye, but undeniable in consequence. Back home, she changed into uniform. Slowly, as always, left boot, right boot, then jacket. 4 stars. She studied herself in the mirror, not with pride, but with memory. 32 years, 8 deployments, 5 commendations, and still, a roadside scene like a wound reopened. Her granddaughter called later that afternoon. "Grandma, what did you do today?" "I taught a lesson," she said. Quietly. The girl laughed and told her about school. The call ended with a soft, "Love you." Elaine sat down with tea, hands now bare, the leather band resting on the table. Some battles weren't fought overseas. Some didn't end with parades or folded flags. They ended on back roads under sunrise, with the weight of a silence only certain people knew how to carry. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floor. Elaine sat at the head of her dining table, the same spot she had occupied for years, during briefings, Sunday dinners, solitary reflections. The house was modest but neat, every photo and plaque perfectly aligned. Her tea had gone cold. The call had lasted exactly 6 minutes and 14 seconds. No one spoke on the other end. No one had to. The Pentagon switchboard was designed for emergencies, chain of command violations, and situations where military authority was compromised. Situations exactly like this. As soon as the call had connected, a silent protocol had been activated. A name, a badge number, a location. No headlines, no panic, just response. By noon, 3 names had been flagged in 2 separate federal databases. The precinct supervisor in Columbus received an encrypted communication with instructions to suspend officers Maddox and Cruz pending review. Simultaneously, a legal advisor within the Department of Defense began assembling a timeline. Elaine's part was already done. She would not be giving testimony. She would not appear in the media. Her silence, once dismissed as passive, had become the very tool that unraveled the certainty of those who had wronged her. The real call came that evening. Private, untraceable. It wasn't a number, it was a code. She answered without greeting. "We received confirmation." "They're moving forward," said a woman's voice. Calm, professional. Elaine nodded, though no one could see her. "We'll ask no more of you," the voice added. "Thank you for maintaining the line." Click. She placed the phone down, looked out the window. Kids played on the street. A young black boy raced his sister on a bike too small for him. They laughed fast and loud. Elaine remembered her father, 1963, Birmingham. He'd come home bleeding once, baton to the ribs, after a protest. "Don't ever give them your fear," he'd told her. "Your fear feeds them." She hadn't. Not at the road, not in the cruiser, not now. Back at the precinct, the shift supervisor reviewed the body cam footage. Maddox had disabled his, a violation. Crew's cam remained active, though his posture throughout suggested discomfort. In the footage, Elaine never raised her voice, never resisted, never deviated from protocol. Still, 2 sets of cuffs had been applied. Unjustified detainment, potential abuse of authority. A civilian oversight panel was notified by morning. The story hadn't leaked, not yet, but it didn't need to. Cruz turned in his badge 3 days later. Maddox refused. 2 weeks after the incident, an envelope arrived at Elaine's home. No return address. Inside, a single photograph, her in uniform, standing on the tarmac in Baghdad, surrounded by soldiers. On the back, a handwritten note, "You shouldn't have to carry this again, I'm sorry. See." She placed the photo on her bookshelf, beside her father's old dog tags and the Purple Heart she had never liked to talk about. It was never about punishment. It was about equilibrium, restoring a balance that tilted quietly every time a uniform was mistaken for a threat instead of a shield. Elaine knew this wasn't the end. Systems did not change overnight. But somewhere, too fewer men wore badges they hadn't earned the right to carry, and somewhere else, a young soldier whispered her name in admiration, unaware of the weight she bore to keep theirs lighter. She stood, straightened her back, and began preparing her uniform for the next day. There was a high school in Atlanta she'd been invited to speak at, black girls in ROTC, future commanders. Future stories. She wouldn't mention the incident, but they would see it. In her walk, in her pause before saying certain words, in the way she looked each of them in the eye and waited for them to meet hers. Some calls didn't need to be spoken. They only needed to be heard. The department's silence cracked first. It started as a murmur, a memo that didn't circulate publicly, but made its way into inboxes with the weight of inevitability. Pending internal review, suspension effective immediately. Officers Maddox and Cruz were removed from active duty without ceremony. There were no public statements, no press conference, just empty desks and whispers. Maddox didn't go quietly. He blamed everything: the hostile environment, unclear ID, military overreach. He filed an internal rebuttal, insisted he'd followed protocol. But protocol was never on his side, and the footage, partial as it was, told a different story. His words rang hollow. Inside the department, the tide was shifting. Quietly, reluctantly, some officers distanced themselves. Others stood behind Maddox, but the numbers dwindled. There were questions no one wanted to answer. Why had the ID been ignored? Why were the cuffs applied so quickly? Why didn't either of them verify her rank? Elaine's name was never mentioned, but everyone knew. A junior officer not long out of academy requested a transfer. "If they don't know who they're pulling over," he said, "what chance do the rest of us have?" Cruz didn't speak to the media. He didn't post online. He sold his home 2 months later and moved to Michigan. In a closed-door session with the oversight panel, he described feeling a moment of panic when he saw her badge. "I knew we'd gone too far," he said. "I just didn't know how to undo it without losing control." Control. That word lingered like smoke. Within the blue wall, the unspoken code of loyalty between officers, fractures began to spread. Older veterans of the force grumbled about accountability. Younger recruits asked harder questions. For the first time in years, internal bias training wasn't a checkbox. but a demand. The story never made national headlines. That was intentional. The Pentagon's influence held strong. But among military channels, Elaine's silence echoed louder than any speech. A memo circulated among high command. The system worked as designed. Let that be remembered. But Elaine didn't see it as a victory. In Atlanta, she stood before the high school gymnasium filled with ROTC cadets. Young faces, black, brown, hopeful. She wore her uniform but left her stars covered. She didn't speak of the incident. Instead, she told them about leadership, about restraint, about battles not fought in deserts, but in silence, battles won not with weapons but with stillness and posture. Afterward, one girl stayed behind. 17. Braids pulled back tight, eyes fixed on the general's boots. "Did anyone ever try to make you feel small?" she asked. Elaine looked at her, the question like a stone pressed gently into her palm. "They tried," she answered. "But I knew what I carried." The girl nodded slowly, then saluted, not out of obligation but understanding. Back at the precinct, Maddox's appeal failed. His badge was revoked. A quiet separation followed. Retired under review. No pension, no honors. There were no protests, no viral videos. Just consequences, rare, cold, and silent. Cruz in Michigan took a job as a night guard. Occasionally he'd see someone who looked like her. He'd stop, watch, then turn away, ashamed of how fast his hands had moved that day. Elaine returned to her routine. Morning runs, strategy meetings, letters of condolence to families of fallen soldiers. Her posture remained the same, but something in her silence had deepened. Not heavy, just settled. There was no joy in what had happened. But there was clarity. The wall had cracked, not shattered, but weakened enough for light to seep through. The day was cool when she returned to Fort Benning. Not cold, just quiet in temperature, the way early November tends to be in Georgia. The leaves had started to shift, their red and gold barely catching sunlight through the thin morning mist. Elaine walked across the parade ground with slow, steady steps. She wasn't in uniform. She didn't need it today. A ceremony was underway. New recruits completing their final exercises, proud families gathered in rows of folding chairs. She stood near the back, arms crossed, eyes soft. No one approached her, not out of fear, but reverence. Some recognized her. Others simply sensed something about the woman who stood so still. The wind shifted slightly, lifting a loose strand of her hair. She didn't move to fix it. Behind her, the commanding officer called for attention. Young soldiers stood taller, straighter. Elaine watched them the way a gardener might watch seedlings, not with ownership, but with hope. These weren't just soldiers. They were inheritors of a lineage far older than the army itself. Later that afternoon, she visited the chapel. Empty pews. A single stained glass window catching the last orange glow of the sun. She sat in the third row, her palms resting on her knees. She thought of her mother, who'd prayed silently every night, not for safety, but for dignity. She thought of herself at 21, in fatigues 2 sizes too big, being told to watch her tone by an instructor who'd failed basic twice. She thought of the road, the cuffs, the silence, the eyes that refused to see, and she thought of the phone call that didn't need words to carry weight. She stayed in the chapel until the light dimmed entirely, until the shapes around her faded and only memory remained. Then she rose, slow but firm, and walked back out into the twilight. The officers who'd restrained her had returned to civilian life, their uniforms replaced with ordinary clothing. No press, no restitution, no acknowledgement, but their absence lingered like a blank space where something should have been. Elaine didn't seek vindication. She didn't crave apology. What she needed was what she already had: composure, reputation, and a history that spoke for itself. That weekend, she hosted her family for dinner. Her son brought sweet tea. Her granddaughter brought a school project about heroes in real life. Elaine read it silently. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, it said, "My grandma keeps people safe, even when it's hard." Elaine smiled. Not wide, just enough. That night, as she washed dishes by the window, the streetlights flickered on. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere down the street, wind chimes tapped gently against each other. No headlines, no speeches, just the sound of life continuing, slow, certain, and slightly different. She dried her hands and turned off the lights. Some battles didn't end in noise. They ended in posture, in memory, in the weight of silence carried with grace. Her name never made the headlines. No flashing banners, no breaking news soundtracks. But in the spaces between routines, in the hallways of command centers, whispered among cadets in the hands that now pause before reaching for a holster, her presence lingered. She didn't demand justice, didn't raise her voice, didn't write op-eds or call press conferences. She simply stood, silent, straight, unmoving. And that was enough to unsettle a structure that so often thrives on chaos, on the noise it provokes, then punishes. She won without striking back, because her life had already been the argument. Her years of service, the bodies she carried, the soldiers she shaped, the homes she helped rebuild in foreign lands, all of it spoke louder than any statement she could have made. And when they cuffed her, the weight didn't fall on her shoulders. It fell, slowly, silently, on theirs. The world is full of maddoxes, men trained to react to what they don't understand with unnecessary force. And cruises, the ones who know they've erred but take too long to let go. But the world is also full of Elaines, women who walk slowly because they've already been everywhere, who carry silence as a shield and memory as a compass. They're not always seen, rarely celebrated, but they are there. If this story stirred something in you, stay with us. Keep listening to voices that never needed to shout to be heard. The next one might be yours.